everybody, and welcome to PT on Ice Daily Show. My name is Christina Previtt. I was already on the podcast on Friday, or on Wednesday. Today is Friday, and I am switching hats. I am lead faculty for clinical management of the fitness, athlete, pregnancy, and postpartum. And if you guys are unsure of what that is, it is actually a new online 8-week course that is going through women who are choosing to exercise in barbell sports, so CrossFit, weightlifting, powerlifting in particular, and how we as physical therapists can help guide them through their pregnancy, in their early postpartum period, and into their longer term postpartum recovery. And so today, I was thinking about talking about what it means to be a postpartum athlete. So to give you guys a little bit of context of my own journey, I am now 6 months, just over 6 months postpartum with my daughter, Maya. And the reason why this kind of topic came up in my mind was that if you guys follow me on Instagram at Christina_Previtt, I have been documenting a lot of my journey just because I used Instagram as a fitness page for a really long time. And so when I got pregnant, my fitness didn't stop. And so I continued. And when you're posting on Instagram, this is going to seem like the most random inspiration for a podcast episode ever, but when you start putting hashtags, there's a lot of fitness and health hashtags, and a lot of times in that period of your life when you're pregnant, postpartum, there's a lot of specific hashtags that are around postpartum fitness and postpartum athlete and pregnancy and postpartum, et cetera, et cetera. And the further away I got from having Maya, I would just start to forget about those hashtags, and I would just start putting fitness hashtags, and I'd be like, oh yeah, I guess I'm kind of postpartum. And so that got me thinking, how long are we identifying ourselves as postpartum athletes? And therefore I went to the gram and I posted a story and I asked women, how long did you consider yourself to be postpartum? And I got a huge variety of responses. And I think it's super, super interesting. So as an orthopedic physical therapist, and I don't do internal pelvic floor, but I work with women for pelvic floor issues, when you think about recovery from an injury, you think, one, acute injuries, you're thinking 6 to 8 weeks. More chronic things, you're thinking maybe 3 to 6 months. But postpartum feels so different because your pregnancy took 9 months, for all of those changes to happen, that increase in anterior tilt and the stretching out of your abdominal wall and all those types of things. And then you went through a traumatic experience with labor and delivery, whether it was vaginal, instrument assisted, or C-section. And when you have those types of experiences, you don't really know what the typical timeline is for recovery and when you will start to not feel like you're postpartum. So on one end of the spectrum, there are a lot of pelvic floor therapists who say that you are postpartum for life. And that makes sense. You're a mom for life, which means that you are post having a baby for life. But when I use the term postpartum athlete, I'm using that as an adjective to describe how you are feeling in your exercise regimen, in your training regimen, in your competition schedule. And I don't necessarily think that a lot of women who are still choosing to compete in sports are going to necessarily identify with that early postpartum period, because it's going to change so much as they get further and further away from their postpartum period, or then they get pregnant again and they're a pregnant athlete again. So what are some of the things that I was thinking about? So when I posted this on the story, the answers were largely that women describe themselves as being in that postpartum period anywhere from 12 months to 24 months was the common answer. So a lot of people were describing it, in that year, 18 months to 24 months range, which was surprising because I'm not there yet. So it was interesting for me. Some women described that they felt like they had an early postpartum period, which was all about that, almost like that acute injury, right? That accelerated recovery that's getting you back to some of your ADLs and IADLs in a new normal, whatever that normal is, especially with a huge change in family dynamic. But then they describe that there is also some things that can happen later on in your pregnancy or in your postpartum period. So some women described how they felt like they recovered fairly well in the first 6 months, and then they felt like they were going right back into their postpartum, that feeling of being postpartum because they had some hormonal issues that happened as they weaned off breastfeeding. They have described issues of thyroid dysfunction, for example, which impaired their fatigue levels, which were already high because they're not sleeping through the night, but compound that with issues with your thyroid and then try and get back into a high level of competition was almost impossible, and it made huge changes to their exercise regimen. And so now they're getting into that 18-month, 24-month and just starting to feel like those hormones have regulated, and therefore they're no longer kind of identifying as being postpartum. For other women, it was as soon as they stopped breastfeeding, whenever that was, because they felt like when they were breastfeeding, there were just so many, I don't want to say things that were stopping you, but there is a barrier because you're the only source of nutrition for your child, unless you're pumping and can bottle feed. But for many women, they feel almost this feeling of being stuck. And if you're trying to train and your baby needs to feed, then there's really nothing that you can do. And so it really does make you feel postpartum. Another way that we can start to describe how long a woman will identify as being a postpartum athlete is around when they start getting back to their numbers that they were at before. It can be their weight. It can be the weight lifted. It can be, their gymnastics skills with CrossFit, their Metcon times. Sometimes women feel like they're in that postpartum period until they're back to their old self and back to their old numbers. All of these different ways of conceptualizing being postpartum, none of them are wrong. None of them are wrong, and all of them are correct for how you are feeling. But I think it's an interesting conversation to have as healthcare providers, because if you're seeing a mom a year after having a baby, are you going through the same diligence around pelvic floor questioning as you would if they were 3 months postpartum? And if they're still identifying as being postpartum and they feel like you're glossing over the fact that they had a baby a year ago, are they going to be upset or feel like you're missing a really important part of their identity in order for you to really optimize your care, optimize your therapeutic alliance, optimize your ability to connect with that female that you were working with? And so the idea of being a postpartum athlete is a really interesting construct, because this identifier can be positive because it allows us to open up these lines of communication. But sometimes I feel that some women are feeling that being a postpartum athlete means that they're in this strive, in this road back to where they were before. And so some women may not have the same positive affiliations with that term, that identifier, and they may want to drop that identifier a lot sooner than others. And so trying to evaluate where the mindset of the athlete that you're working with is in regards to their postpartum athleticism and what they feel is their state or where they are along that continuum, I think is really important. Personally, in my journey postpartum, I always felt, even though I'm still super new postpartum, I'm only 6 months postpartum, I felt like 6 months is a long time. In my mind, half a year is a long time. It's a very long training block where I'm still not back to the numbers. But over the last several weeks, I've started to feel like my midline stability has started to reestablish. My lower extremity strength is getting back there. I'm able to push out of the hole. I'm not constantly being almost too hypervigilant, and I've talked about this around any sort of incontinence, pelvic floor, prolapse type of symptoms, and I'm starting to feel from an athletic perspective like me. I'm not sleeping through the night, so my recovery is not there, and I feel like I'm going to look back on these podcasts and you're going to start, if you're watching the video, you're going to start to see my black circles get more and more etched along my face the further postpartum that I am until my daughter starts to sleep through the night. But now that I'm starting to feel a little bit more like I have the same force production, the same stability, some of my core integrity is coming back, I am identifying postpartum, but I'm not necessarily identifying as strongly, I guess. And so I think it's an interesting conversation. So in regards to how, if we're looking at the bottom clinical line, or our clinical application for this, one is that a lot of women will feel like they're still in their postpartum period between 12 months and 24 months, depending on the situation. I feel like the more things that have happened postpartum, the more things that are influencing a person's ability to go back to exercise, if that is something that is important to them, is going to be a big modulating factor for how long they're identifying with that term. For example, if they've had thyroid issues, if they've had to see a pelvic therapist because they've had quite a few complications with pelvic girdle pain or pubic symphysis dysfunction or pelvic organ prolapse or incontinence, they're probably going to be holding on to that that postpartum label for a lot longer. Some women are going to feel like postpartum is a lifelong journey. That is totally okay and absolutely true. And so they may always acknowledge that part of their life, just like they acknowledge this new piece of the pie of being a mom or a mom again. For many women, some of the things that really decide whether or not they're feeling like a postpartum athlete are around athletic markers. And so if they're back to where they were before or exceeding some of their financial, oh my goodness, what words am I using? If their physical feats or accomplishments and they're starting to feel like they're either approaching on their old numbers or starting to exceed, they may feel like they're out of that postpartum period. Other things may be around some of the ideas around where they are in their life. So they may not feel so much that they're as much of a postpartum athlete anymore if they, for example, stopped breastfeeding, which for some women like me was at 4 months postpartum, but for some women it's 18, 24 months after the delivery of their child when they stop breastfeeding, and that might be when they start to release that term of postpartum athlete. That being said, because of those two modulating factors, I think it's an important conversation to have if you're working with any female athlete that has had children in the last several years. Kind of get an idea about where her mindset is. Still be as diligent with your subjective questioning in regards to her postpartum experience, her labor and delivery experience, her pregnancy, because it will very strongly shape the first several years of her life, and use that information to start building therapeutic alliance. So if you can kind of identify where a woman is along the continuum, if she has positive versus negative associations with the term postpartum athlete, and if she is identifying strongly in that camp, then you can definitely start gearing some of your conversations to make sure that you are acknowledging that very, very important part of her life. All right, I hope you guys found that helpful. I will be back in, I think, 2 weeks for the Jerry on Ice podcast, as well as the Fitness Athlete Friday podcast. So you're going to see me again twice in 1 week in a couple of weeks. I hope you guys have a wonderful, wonderful weekend. Here is our Santa Claus parade. There's a huge Santa Claus parade in Toronto here in Ontario. And that is this weekend, so I'm getting Christmas crazy. And it's my daughter's first Christmas, so I'm super, super excited. So I hope you guys have something fun like that planned for this weekend for yourselves. If you guys have any questions, or if you want to put your own experiences around being a postpartum athlete and how long you identified, I would love to hear your thoughts. If you agree with me, if you don't agree with me, what made you identify that way as a postpartum athlete? And if that is the case, just put your comments below. Bye, guys.
Hey, thanks for tuning in to the PT on Ice Daily Show. If you enjoyed this content, head on over to iTunes and leave us a review. And be sure to check us out on Facebook and Instagram at the Institute of Clinical Excellence. If you're interested in getting plugged into more ICE content on a weekly basis while earning CEUs from home, check out our virtual ICE online mentorship program at ptonice.com. While you're there, sign up for our Hump Day Hustling newsletter for a free email every Wednesday morning with our top 5 research articles and social media posts that we think are worth reading. Head over to ptonice.com and scroll to the bottom of the page to sign up.